The most dangerous people in society are often not the ones who think they are better than everyone else. They are the ones who never stop to question why they were given more power in the first place. That sounds backwards. We usually imagine arrogance as something loud. Someone boasting. Someone looking down on others. Someone announcing their superiority for the world to hear. But what if the deeper problem isn't arrogance at all? What if the real danger begins when privilege becomes so normal that it disappears from view? This is where Lady Catherine becomes far more unsettling than many readers realize. Because she does not operate like a villain obsessed with proving her greatness. In many ways, she doesn't seem interested in proving anything. Her authority feels automatic. Natural. Self-evident. Like gravity. Like the changing of seasons. Like a law of nature that nobody would think to challenge. And that is exactly what makes her worth examining. Here's the question at the center of this story. What happens when a person inherits a position so completely that they stop seeing it as power? Most discussions about power focus on people who abuse it knowingly. Tyrants. Manipulators. Ambitious figures who actively seek control. But history reveals a stranger pattern. Some of the most enduring systems are not maintained by people who consciously choose domination. They are maintained by people who sincerely believe they are simply preserving order. Think about that for a moment. A person who knows they hold power can be confronted, challenged, resisted. But what do you do with someone who believes the entire structure around them is simply the way the world works? That creates a different kind of problem. Because now inequality no longer appears as inequality. It appears as common sense. Authority no longer feels imposed. It feels deserved. And hierarchy no longer looks like a system. It looks like reality itself. This is the first paradox hidden inside Lady Catherine. She is not merely a character. She functions as a living institution. A symbol. A person shaped so completely by social conditioning that the walls around her become invisible. One of the most powerful images in this entire discussion is not a throne, a title, or a grand estate. It is something much simpler. Imagine a palace that has stood for so many generations that the people living inside it no longer recognize it as a palace. They call it nature. They call it tradition. They call it normal. And once that happens, questioning the palace begins to feel like questioning reality itself. But this raises a much larger mystery. If privilege can become invisible to the people who possess it, then how many systems survive not because they are defended by cruelty, but because they are protected by habit? How many hierarchies remain intact because they have existed for so long that nobody remembers they were built by human beings? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what if the reason Lady Catherine still feels familiar today has nothing to do with 19th century England? What if she represents a pattern that appears whenever power becomes indistinguishable from normality? Because once power becomes invisible, it stops looking like power. And that may be the moment it becomes strongest. If power becomes strongest when it turns invisible, then we need to ask a more uncomfortable question. How does that happen? How does an entire society stop seeing a hierarchy that is standing directly in front of it? The answer may be hidden in something far more powerful than laws, wealth, or titles. Stories. Not the stories people tell for entertainment. The stories they tell themselves about reality. Every stable social order depends on a narrative. A set of assumptions so deeply accepted that they no longer feel like assumptions. They feel like facts. This is where the conflict surrounding Lady Catherine becomes much more profound than a disagreement between individuals. She represents a worldview. A mental map. A vision of society in which every person has a place, every place has a rank, and every rank carries expectations that should not be questioned. Notice the contradiction. From a modern perspective, hierarchy often appears oppressive because we begin with the idea that people possess equal human worth. But what if you begin somewhere else? What if you genuinely believe that order is more important than equality? What if you believe society functions best when everyone accepts the role they inherited? Suddenly, actions that look unfair from one perspective begin to look responsible from another. And that is the trap. The most resilient systems rarely survive because people love injustice. They survive because people fear disorder. That distinction matters, because it transforms the psychology of power. A person defending privilege may see themselves not as selfish, but as protective. Not as controlling, but as preserving stability. Not as defending inequality, but as defending civilization itself. This is why simple moral explanations often fail. They assume the conflict is between good people and bad people. But many of history's most enduring structures were maintained by people who sincerely believed they were doing the right thing. That realization should make us pause, because it moves the conversation away from individual character and toward collective perception. A society does not need everyone to agree on everything. It only needs enough people to accept the same invisible assumptions. And once that happens, something remarkable occurs. The system begins to reproduce itself. Parents teach it. Institutions reward it. Customs reinforce it. Language protects it. Eventually, the original justification disappears. Only the habit remains. Think of a staircase that has existed for hundreds of years. At first, people remember who built it and why. Generations later, they simply assume the staircase belongs there. No one asks who designed it. No one asks whether it still serves a purpose. People merely continue climbing. That is another memory fragment worth holding on to. The most powerful staircase is the one nobody notices anymore. And this brings us closer to the central mystery. Because Lady Catherine is not merely standing at the top of that staircase. She seems unable to imagine a world without it. The hierarchy has become inseparable from reality itself. But if that is true, then another question emerges. A far more unsettling one. If some people inherit privilege without seeing it, can others inherit obedience without seeing that too? And if both sides are participating in the same story, then where does real change actually begin? With the people who benefit from the system? Or with the people who first learned to see that the staircase was built by human hands? But what if seeing the staircase is only the beginning of the problem? Because once a hierarchy becomes visible, another contradiction immediately emerges. Many people assume that those at the top are the primary defenders of the system. Yet systems often survive because people at every level help sustain them. That is the deeper crisis hidden beneath the surface. The story is no longer about privilege alone. It is about participation. And this is where another figure quietly enters the picture. Not as an individual, but as a pattern. The pattern of voluntary obedience. Every social order produces two kinds of people. Those who inherit authority. And those who learn to admire it. One cannot survive very long without the other. That observation forces us into uncomfortable territory. Because it suggests that power is not merely something imposed from above. Sometimes it is reinforced from below. Sometimes people defend a hierarchy that disadvantages them. Sometimes they become guardians of the very structure that limits them. Why? Because certainty is often more comforting than freedom. This is one of the oldest paradoxes in human history. Freedom sounds appealing in theory. But uncertainty is exhausting. A rigid social order may restrict opportunity, yet it also provides answers. It tells people who matters, who belongs, who should lead, who should follow. It transforms ambiguity into structure, and structure into psychological comfort. This is the contradiction that begins to expose the true scale of the problem. The conflict is not between powerful people and powerless people. The conflict is between awareness and unconscious participation. That changes everything. Because now the question is no longer whether a system is fair. The question becomes whether people can even recognize the system while living inside it. Imagine a fish attempting to discover water. Imagine a person attempting to notice the air around them. The closer something is to everyday experience, the harder it becomes to see. That is another memory fragment worth keeping. The strongest cage is not the one built from iron. It is the one mistaken for the horizon. And once a society reaches that point, a remarkable transformation occurs. Hierarchy begins to wear the mask of morality. Custom becomes virtue. Expectation becomes duty. Compliance becomes character. People stop asking whether the structure is just. Instead, they ask whether individuals are behaving correctly inside it. The entire conversation shifts. The architecture disappears. Only behavior remains visible. This may be one of the most important insights hidden beneath the world that Lady Catherine represents. Her significance is not that she possesses authority. Many characters possess authority. Her significance is that she embodies a worldview in which authority no longer requires justification. And when authority stops needing justification, something dangerous happens. Future generations inherit conclusions without inheriting questions. They receive answers without ever examining the assumptions that produced them. The staircase remains. The palace remains. The invisible map remains. Yet nobody remembers who drew it. Or why. This is where the crisis escalates from social conditioning into something much larger. A civilization can survive disagreement. It can survive conflict. It can even survive corruption. But can it survive the loss of self-examination? What happens when an entire culture becomes so accustomed to its assumptions that questioning them begins to feel irrational? And perhaps that leads us toward an even deeper mystery. What if the greatest threat to a system is not rebellion at all? What if the greatest threat is a single person who asks a question that the system never expected anyone to ask? I think that question points us toward the real revelation. The deeper issue was never whether a particular person held authority. The deeper issue is why some forms of authority become so unquestionable that challenging them feels like a violation of reality itself. This is where the symbol of Lady Catherine begins. To transform. Up to this point, she may appear to represent privilege, hierarchy, or inherited status. But beneath those layers lies something even more fundamental. She represents certainty. Not intellectual certainty. Moral certainty. Social certainty. Existential certainty. She exists within a framework that answers questions before they are asked. Who should lead? The framework already knows. Who should follow? The framework already knows. Who belongs where? The framework already knows. And when a system provides answers to every important question, it offers something extraordinarily seductive to the human mind. Relief. Because uncertainty is difficult. Ambiguity is uncomfortable. Complexity is exhausting. Human beings often prefer a flawed map over having no map at all. That preference may explain why rigid social structures survive for generations. Their greatest strength is not force. Their greatest strength is psychological comfort. Here we discover another contradiction. People often imagine freedom as the opposite of oppression. Yet many historical systems endured because they reduced anxiety. They gave people identities, expectations, and boundaries. The cost was flexibility. The reward was certainty. That trade has appeared again and again across civilizations. Which leads us to a revealing insight about Lady Catherine's role. She is not merely benefiting from the map. She has become part of the map. Her influence extends beyond her position because she embodies an entire philosophy of order. She becomes a symbol of what happens when a social structure successfully disguises itself as common sense. Consider another memory fragment. Imagine an ancient compass passed down through countless generations. Nobody remembers who made it. Nobody remembers why it points in a particular direction. Yet everyone continues following it. Eventually the compass gains an almost sacred authority. Not because people understand it, but because they cannot imagine navigating without it. That image moves us beyond individual behavior and into the realm of civilization itself. Every society possesses invisible compasses. Beliefs about success. Beliefs about status. Beliefs about intelligence. Beliefs about who deserves influence and who does not. Most people inherit these assumptions long before they ever examine them. The result is profound. Entire populations can organize their lives around ideas they never consciously chose. At that point, power no longer depends on institutions alone. It begins operating through perception, through expectation, through identity, through the stories people tell themselves about what is normal. And that may be the most significant consequence of all. Once a hierarchy becomes embedded inside perception, removing it becomes extraordinarily difficult. Because people are no longer defending a system. They are defending their understanding of reality. Suddenly disagreement feels dangerous. Questions feel disruptive. Alternatives feel irrational. Which brings us to a revelation that changes the scale of the entire discussion. Perhaps the true significance of Lady Catherine is not that she represents privilege. Perhaps she represents what every civilization eventually risks becoming, a structure that forgets the difference between what is natural and what is merely familiar. And if that distinction disappears, then a new mystery emerges. What if the greatest source of power is not wealth, status, or authority at all? What if the greatest source of power is the ability to convince people that a human invention has always existed? If a society can mistake familiarity for nature, then we arrive at the deepest question in this entire discussion. What was Jane Austen actually warning us about? The answer is more subtle than class, privilege, or even hierarchy. The core revelation is that the most durable forms of inequality do not survive because people consciously choose injustice. They survive because human beings possess an extraordinary ability to normalize whatever surrounds them. That is the hidden force operating beneath everything we have explored so far. Lady Catherine is not merely the beneficiary of a social order. She is evidence of what happens when a social order succeeds so completely that it disappears into the background of consciousness. This is the insight many readers miss. The real conflict is not between privilege and equality. It is between awareness and normalization. Once that becomes visible, the entire structure changes. Suddenly Lady Catherine is no longer the center of the story. She becomes a symptom. A signal. A visible expression of a much deeper human tendency. Throughout history, people have adapted to almost anything. Customs. Institutions. Beliefs. Power structures. Given enough time, even the most artificial arrangements can begin to feel inevitable. This may be one of the strangest characteristics of human nature. We are remarkably skilled at questioning new ideas. We are remarkably poor at questioning inherited assumptions. Consider another memory fragment. Imagine an old painting hanging in a room for generations. At first, everyone notices it. They discuss it. They debate it. They wonder why it is there. Decades pass. Then centuries. Eventually, nobody sees the painting anymore. It becomes part of the wall. The painting has not disappeared. Awareness has. That image captures the deepest role of Lady Catherine. She is the painting that became part of the wall. Her significance lies not in what she believes, but in what she no longer needs to believe consciously. The assumptions have already been absorbed into the environment itself. This revelation expands far beyond one character, one novel, or one historical moment. Every society creates invisible assumptions. Every generation inherits maps drawn by people it never met. Every institution develops beliefs that eventually become so familiar they stop appearing as beliefs at all. And this leads to an uncomfortable consequence. The greatest barriers to change are often not external restrictions. They are internal certainties. The things people stop questioning. The things they assume have always existed. The things that feel too obvious to examine. Once a society reaches that point, reform becomes difficult because the challenge is no longer structural. It becomes perceptual. People cannot change what they cannot see. They cannot question what feels self-evident. They cannot evaluate assumptions they mistake for reality itself. This transforms the meaning of Lady Catherine's legacy. Her lasting significance is not tied to aristocracy. Aristocracies rise and fall. Titles appear and disappear. Social structures evolve. The deeper pattern survives. It reappears wherever human beings confuse familiarity with truth. Wherever inherited assumptions replace conscious examination. Wherever comfort becomes more attractive than awareness. And perhaps that is the final revelation hidden beneath everything we have explored. The greatest source of social power may not be the ability to control people. It may be the ability to shape what people perceive as normal. Because if normality can be engineered, inherited, and protected, then a far larger question emerges. What invisible assumptions are shaping our lives right now, not because they are true, but because they have been hanging on the wall for so long that we no longer notice they are there? The consequences of this realization extend much further than a single character, a single social class, or even a single century. Once we understand that invisible assumptions shape human behavior, we begin to see the true cost of leaving them unexamined. The cost is not merely unfairness. The cost is intellectual stagnation. It is the gradual loss of a society's ability to distinguish between what exists and what deserves to exist. This is the legacy hidden beneath the surface of everything we have explored. Lady Catherine's lasting influence is not found in authority itself. Authority always changes hands. Titles fade. Institutions rise and fall. The deeper legacy is the pattern she represents. The pattern in which inherited certainty quietly replaces active thought. The pattern in which people stop evaluating reality and begin merely inheriting it. Consider what happens when this process unfolds over generations. Children inherit assumptions from parents. Communities inherit assumptions from institutions. Entire cultures inherit assumptions from history. Eventually, nobody remembers where the assumptions came from. They remain present, but their origins disappear. This creates a strange form of collective amnesia. People remember conclusions. They forget questions. That may be one of the most dangerous consequences of all. Because questions are the mechanism through which societies adapt. Without them, systems become rigid. Without them, beliefs become untouchable. Without them, even intelligent people can become trapped inside inherited mental frameworks. Another memory fragment emerges here. Imagine a massive tree whose roots have spread beneath an entire city. The buildings change. The streets change. The people change. Yet the roots remain hidden underground, shaping everything above them. Most people never see the roots. They only experience their effects. In many ways, that is how inherited assumptions operate. They shape expectations, opportunities, identities, and relationships long before anyone consciously notices them. This helps explain why the legacy of certain ideas often outlives the structures that created them. A hierarchy can disappear while its psychological habits remain. An institution can collapse while its assumptions continue influencing behavior. A law can be removed while its worldview survives inside culture. That is why the deepest consequences are rarely material. They are perceptual. They shape how people interpret reality itself. And this is where the scale expands again. The lesson is no longer about one historical setting. It becomes a lesson about human nature. Every generation inherits invisible maps. Every generation receives assumptions disguised as common sense. Every generation faces the same challenge, deciding which ideas deserve preservation and which deserve examination. The tragedy is that many people never realize this challenge exists. They spend their lives navigating maps they did not create, following compasses they did not choose, defending conclusions they never consciously evaluated. That is the psychological consequence. The social consequence is equally profound. Communities become vulnerable to repeating old patterns under new names. The symbols change. The language changes. The structure evolves. Yet the underlying habit remains untouched. The habit of mistaking familiarity for truth. The habit of accepting inherited certainty as evidence. The habit of confusing comfort with understanding. This is why the legacy of the ideas we have explored still matters today. Not because the world remains the same, but because human beings remain human. We still seek stability. We still prefer certainty. We still struggle to recognize the assumptions closest to us. And perhaps that leaves us facing one final paradox before we reach the end of this journey. If the most powerful assumptions are the ones we cannot see, then how can anyone ever know whether they are thinking freely or merely repeating ideas that have become invisible through familiarity? Perhaps the lasting power of great literature has very little to do with the answers it provides. Perhaps its true value lies in the questions it refuses to let us escape. Long after the details fade, Long after specific characters become distant memories, something remains. A feeling. A suspicion. A subtle shift in perception. The sense that reality may be more constructed than it first appears. That is the legacy we are left with here. Not a lesson about one person. Not a lesson about one social order. But a lesson about the fragile relationship between human beings and the worlds they inherit. Throughout this journey, certain images have followed us like shadows. A palace mistaken for nature. A staircase nobody notices anymore. A compass whose origin has been forgotten. A painting that became part of the wall. A vast root system hidden beneath a city. None of these images are really about institutions. They are about perception. They are about the strange human tendency to stop seeing the forces that shape us most deeply. And perhaps that is why this story continues to resonate across generations. The external structures may change, but the underlying challenge remains remarkably consistent. Every era develops its own invisible assumptions. Every culture creates its own version of normal. Every individual inherits beliefs, expectations, and categories that feel self-evident simply because they arrived before conscious awareness. The question is not whether this happens. The question is whether we ever notice it happening. That realization changes how we think about wisdom. Wisdom may not be the accumulation of certainty. It may be the willingness to examine certainty itself. It may be the ability to look at the staircase and ask who built it. To look at the compass and ask who designed it. To look at the painting and see it again after years of walking past it without notice. This perspective also changes how we think about human dignity. True dignity may begin when people become capable of distinguishing between what has always been present and what has merely been present for a very long time. Those are not the same thing. Yet history repeatedly shows how easy it is to confuse them. Familiarity creates comfort. Comfort creates trust. Trust creates acceptance. And acceptance can quietly transform human inventions into unquestioned realities. That process is neither entirely good nor entirely bad. No society can function without shared assumptions. No individual can examine every belief from the ground up. The deeper challenge is knowing which assumptions deserve trust and which deserve scrutiny. Knowing when a map is guiding us and when it is limiting us. Knowing when a tradition preserves wisdom and when it preserves blindness. Perhaps that is the final human meaning hidden beneath everything we have explored. The greatest responsibility of consciousness is not simply choosing between right and wrong. It is learning to recognize the invisible frameworks through which right and wrong are interpreted in the first place. And maybe that leaves us with one final thought. Somewhere in every life there is a palace that feels like nature, a staircase that feels inevitable, a compass that feels permanent. The question is not whether those things exist. The question is whether we can still see them clearly enough to ask where they came from, why they remain, and whether the world they point toward is truly reality, or merely familiarity wearing the mask of truth.